I'm Monica Rhodes, Director of Partnerships for the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites and current Loeb Fellow at Harvard University. This evening, I'm standing in for the center's faculty director and fearless leader, Randy Mason. Although they are off screen, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Sarah Lerner, Manager of Research and Communications, as well as Steph Garcia, Project Coordinator with the center. Sarah will field questions from the audience when we are in the Q&A period of the conversation. The Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites is part of the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania and works at the intersection of research, teaching, and fieldwork to advance our understanding of historic places commemorating American civil rights histories and Black heritage. One of the many activities of the center is the Dialogue virtual series, which focuses on raising the visibility and deepening discussions on the critical role that preservation has and continues to play in expanding our national understanding of civil rights heritage. For today's program, we will have 45 minutes of discussion, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the discussion tonight, as well as follow the center's updates on the Twitter and IG at the civil rights sites. And also feel free to visit the website for more information. All right, that's the official introduction. So let's get into it. Tonight, I'm honored to be in conversation with Danielle Purifoy. Dr. Purifoy is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Purifoy completed her Ph.D. in environmental politics and African American studies at Duke University, earned a BA in English and political science from Vassar College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Danielle's current research traces the roots of contemporary environmental conditions in the US South, specifically in Black towns, dating back to the post-Bellum era. Dr. Purifoy also has written about the legal dimensions of environmental justice and equity in food systems. Danielle is the former race and place editor at Scalawag, I love that name, by the way, a magazine devoted to Southern politics and culture, and serves as the board chair of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. So, Dr. Purifoy, welcome to the discussion tonight. We are so pleased to have you, and we're going to jump right in if that's okay. So, can you please introduce your work more broadly, thinking about your background that includes training as a lawyer, work in African American studies, journalism, and now a professor of geography. Just wanted to hear more about not only your professional journey, but how you approach your work with such a varied professional and educational background.
Well, thank you so much, Monica, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's really great to be with you tonight, and thanks to everyone for attending tonight. So the way that I think about my work, I guess, is more subject-oriented than discipline-oriented, as you probably can tell. My work really centers around what we call Black geographies, specifically in my case, local Black places, Black-founded places that are, typically quite small, and some as small as what we might think of as neighborhoods, and some as large as towns. And I think about those places really in the context of the history of the United States, and how our cities and towns have been formulated throughout history, our kind of understandings of what towns are. I came to this work through studying environmental racism. I really noticed that in addition to the sort of accepted knowledge that environmental burdens, hazards, and and lacks, right, of environmental amenities are located disproportionately in communities of color, and particularly Black and Indigenous communities. I noticed that in addition to that now accepted wisdom, that there's that a lot of the places that are among the most burdened in the United States are places that were Black founded. And I think that there's, given the really long history of racial terror, right, and destruction of Black places, that we know from, right, the 19th and 20th centuries, and even before then, right? Environmental racism is it's a more contemporary, I mean, it's always existed, right? But it's a more enduring, I should say, facet of terrorism, essentially, against Black places. And so came to understanding or focusing in on Black founded places through these studies of environmental racism. And it's been important for me to write about them in multiple ways, right? So writing about them for the public as a journalist, writing about them in scholarly works, and really thinking about the town not just as a social place, but as a political and legal place. And so some of the law training, right, that I had really prepared me to start thinking about what it actually means to be a town, and what kinds of developments are allowed in specific kinds of towns, and how the law has been shaped, right, to preserve, right, local white places at the expense often, right, of Black founded places.
No, thank you. So as you were sharing this, enduring legacy of racism, it's kind of popped out to me, especially considering the center's work around civil rights heritage. And just thinking through, especially given your background and your legal training, what's your conception of civil rights as a preservation movement? And the center focuses in that particular area and ensuring that we're having national conversations and a deeper understanding of what that heritage looks like and those places that often are left out of our textbooks. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, coupled with how do you see it, your conception of civil rights, how do you see that challenging the current day conceptions of what we now think what civil rights is, if that makes sense. So let me just ask this in a different type of way. What's your conception of civil rights, and how do you see it challenging the usual senses that we hear and what we feel and what we think when the word civil rights is being invoked?
Sure. So I think that the civil rights, that Black folks and various marginalized groups have fought for over the course of history in the United States have certainly, fallen within, in some ways, right, like the confines of how the state defines it, right? The pulling on the Constitution, right, pulling on existing law, in a lot of ways, because that's what you had to appeal to. But I've always thought, and I think that there's just overwhelming evidence of this, that, and I'll speak specifically about Black people who are fighting in the era that we now call the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Freedom Movement, and even before, right, and still today, that the idea of civil rights is something in excess, right, of how people and freedom have been envisioned in the United States. So, in other words, you work within the sort of boundaries of the legal and political structures that you have to capture, even just, right, or to attempt to capture even just the essence of civil rights as defined by the state. But certainly in practice, in a lot of the Black founded communities that I'm privileged to study, there's something more there, right? There's something that extends far beyond that. And it's, I think that it is hard to pin down into any one definition, but what I guess I can outline some facets of it that I see reflected in Black places, right? Because I mean, I can't actually think of a better way to actually think of a manifestation, right, of what freedom looks like, and what your ideals of what it means to be a person, right, like a full human being in the world, then sort of looking at the places that you create, right, for yourself and the people around you. So in a lot of Black places, there's what a historian and we call him geographer, J.T. Rohn, calls the Black Commons, a real reliance on shared economies, right, and shared resources for the common good. We have a conceptualization, right, in our legal language of a commonwealth, right, but it doesn't actually manifest that way for everyone in the country. Within these Black places, you see, and I don't want to define it as a commonwealth because they haven't defined it as a commonwealth, but something, right, that looks closer to that kind of conceptualization. And I think, it perhaps even exceeds beyond it. And an idea that there's a relationship to land that is not about an exchange value, right? It's not about, it's not interchangeable, it's not fungible. And what you see, how that manifests is through things like home places, right? Plots where multiple generations of families, particularly in places where there's more land to be had, right? So in the South, right, in more rural spaces, but you can see evidence of those sort of commonly held properties, essentially by the family, in more urban spaces as well. But in a lot of the Black founded places that I study, it's a multi-generational, right, relationship to land, not only just through the people who live on the land at any given time, but through this sense of stewardship, right? The sense that if you take care of the land will take care of you. And that's not just, right, those aren't just ethos of Black places. I mean, you can certainly see those ethics, right, those ideals reflected in Indigenous lands as well. But in the places where I study, there's a very different conceptualization of place that I think gets overlooked when we continue to sort of compare Black founded places to their white counterparts, right, within the sort of existing political and legal framework that we're conditioned to understand it in. So what that means, right, like that translates into something different than what I think civil rights is. That translates into a kind of freedom that I think has been harder for me to, as I said, it's harder for me to define exactly, but certainly a a freedom to be fully who you are, a freedom to be without money if you don't have it, right? A freedom to not concern yourself with the kind of burdens that individual property ownership saddles you with, and the anxieties, the freedom to stay in place and in relationship to land. Those are some things that I've seen reflected in Black places that I think exceed, right, this sort of commonly accepted definition of civil rights.
Yeah, in addition to that, I mean, what I heard as you were giving your beautiful answer was these concepts that we have in preservation and heritage more broadly is this intangible and tangible heritage, right? Something like, the land and space and buildings you can understand, but then there's something deeper. There's another layer deeper, and these cultural values, creating space for them to be honored in a way that isn't measured against a measuring stick that's not equal for all people. Like each particular group of people, have their own ideas and value their own cultural beliefs and their own ways of being that is different than the majority of the population. And your work creates space to understand all of those nuances, both in current day, and so glad you're in the conversation with us, also talking about how preservation is a part of that discussion as well. So talking about land, let's go down to Alabama, where some of your work is as well, in addition to North Carolina. But can you expand on this idea of the connection between environmental justice as a civil rights issue, particularly as we're thinking about the work of the Alabama Black Belt? And as you know, the center is doing work not only with Tuskegee University, but the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Consortium, for example. But just wanted to hear your thoughts on that environmental justice as a civil rights issue, and just share a little bit more about your work down in Alabama, please.
Sure. Gosh, there's quite a bit to say there. So in Alabama, the work that I started there, and this was part of the work that really led me to focus more heavily on Black founded towns, as opposed to thinking about sort of environmental racism as a pattern in practice, right, within those places. And I think one of the reasons why Lowndes County, which is where the county in the Black Belt where I was, over the course of a 1 to 2 years sort of visiting, and I have family who is from that area of the state and that region. I think that Lowndes County's long, right, and storied history with Black relations to land, right, not just through, right, slavery and those various forms of exploitation, but what came after, right, which was a lot of Black communities, Black founded communities establishing themselves on the very lands, right, to which they were enslaved, and developing a different kind of relationship to those lands. And so it was by really paying attention to what the Black residents, right, the Black folks and families who had been there for generations, how they were relating to the land, that kind of helped me shift my focus away a little bit, right, from what how environmental racism is set up, which is really all about, right, how whiteness, right, and white supremacy, right, imposes itself onto Black places, attempts to destroy, right, Black places. So how how that was happening in the Black Belt was through a number of, right, different strategies. There's the wastewater, sanitation, and infrastructure challenge there that Catherine Coleman Flowers, who won the MacArthur Genius Award for her work trying to expand greatly, right, access to wastewater sanitation across the country, but she's from the Alabama Black Belt. She's from Rounds County. That work was sort of what brought me to the region to begin with. But there's also industrial farming, right? The plantation continues in a different arena. It continues through industrial hog farms, right? Industrial poultry farms, and factories, right? All of which are, not just massively, right, abusive to and it's sort of obliterating of like animals, right? Like a very different relationship than your family farmer might have to a pig or a cow or a hen. But also, that sort of heavy industrialized processing of meat essentially is deeply connected to the exploitation of the labor, of the bodies, right, of the economic economic and social well-being of Black people in that region. And more recently, I'd say within the last decade, the biomass industry has expanded greatly throughout the Southeast, including in areas like the Black Belt, more recently than that in the Black Belt. And that industry is essentially deforesting, right, vast swaths of the Southeast in order to produce biomass in the form of these sort of little wood pellets for energy in Europe to burn in essentially in coal-fired power plants as a kind of substitute for coal. And so all of these things, right, are impacting, right, the lives and livelihoods and the sustainability, right, of living, of daily living for folks in the Black Belt. And, environmental justice came about through civil rights organizers. That terminology, environmental racism, environmental justice, right, came from folks like Ben Chavis, right, who was then, at the time in the 80s in Warren County, North Carolina, about an hour or so from where I live here in Durham, came directly out of a civil rights conceptualization, right, of like what it would actually mean for Black folks to have access to a healthy environment, and the sort of violation, right, of that. So it's intimately linked. But I do think that there's been, again, like to my earlier point about these Black communities defining, right, their lives and their existence beyond, right, the sort of construction of how we commonly understand civil rights. You can see it, right, in those relationships to land, right? Like that is a vision of environmental justice, right? That I think that, some folks definitely have in mind when they're fighting against these extractive industries.
Yeah, and just, as you're thinking of, or talking about environmental justice, I was just thinking about Dr. Robert Bullard's work, known as the father of environmental justice. But just to zoom out again, there was a reason why folks like Amelia Boynton was down in Selma and what they were fighting for. The right to vote for, the ability to determine their collective futures. A reason why the Black Panther Party has roots in Loudoun County. The reason why the vote was suppressed. The reason why. When folks were marching from Selma to Montgomery along, that 54-mile highway, that they camped at these campground sites that were and still are owned by Black folks to be able to go there for safety and having Black officers protect them along the way. So you're getting at some fundamental, like, historical preservation questions that we're grappling with to this day.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say, yes, thank you. I mean, it absolutely. I mean, I think that, within the sort of political legal structure, right, in which we exist, it is about voting, right? It is about representation, right? Like that, those are the strategies that you use to try to bring about decisions that you hope, right, will manifest in the well-being of the places where you live, work, and play, right? Like that, it's absolutely true. And in fact, after in the aftermath of the Black freedom movement in the 60s and, extending, to after the, Black power movements and Black arts movements of the 70s, you saw places like Whitehall, Alabama, which is in Lowndes County, and which is where SNCC, right, was, for those who don't know, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was, right, super active, right, even after the Voting Rights March of 1965 from Selma to Montgomery. It went directly through Lowndes County. That's what that stretch is, right, of that march. In 1979, right, Whitehall, that area where SNCC had been, fought for municipal incorporation because it wanted to have a state charter in order to access, basic public funding for services that it didn't have. At the time, it would take you 30 minutes, right, to get to a hospital if you were any kind of health distress. And so a lot of folks there were dying of, perfectly preventable deaths. And there was a serious need to be able to access the kind of resources to bring about those public services that most towns and cities take for granted. But, if you talk to some of the folks down there, and particularly the first mayor of that town, the town of Whitehall, what you'll find was that incorporation didn't really manifest, right, those kinds of services in the ways that they were expected. So I have, and voting, right, being able, Black folks in that community being able to vote for their own public, right, elected officials, right, certainly engendered some change, but not nearly, right, what you might expect in a, from incorporating as a municipality, as you see in white towns, right? And so there's, very quickly, I think, the communities there had to realize that relying on those political rights, relying on those standardized channels was never going to be enough, right, to accomplish a kind of durable freedom for themselves. And so there have been all sorts of other, other strategies towards, those sort of things and negotiations that are super complex. Right? You have to get very creative if the standard rules don't apply to you. And so that, so I just want to say that, that fight, right? And I think it's chronicled very well in Hassan Jeffries' Bloody Lowndes. You should read it. It's a great historian. It's a great chronicling of that history, but sort of the aftermath, right? Like what ends up happening to that same place, right? Where where voting rights was won, right, in that space, really ends. It doesn't end. It's just sort of currently, right, in this mode of, so it didn't work quite the way that we'd hoped, right? It wasn't for naught, right? Absolutely not. But like, it's also not getting us the vision of equality, right, that maybe some of us had imagined. I don't think everyone imagined that this would, be an end to racial inequality. but yeah, and so there's a lot of, creative thinking, I think, about what it means to be a Black place, what it means to create, right, a safe space for Black folks that continues, right, into our current day.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with everything that you said. You raised some really important questions, but I wanted to just underscore the fact that we have had some really good conversations with Dr. Jeffries, and certainly encourage the audience to check out that book. It's well done. So Danielle, so now you've laid a very solid groundwork between this intersection for the audience, in between civil rights and in environmental justice. So what is your research going forward? What kind of things are you thinking about, hoping to work on next? Please share out anything that you're ready to reveal to the audience on, where this work is headed.
Sure. So yeah, I am still very much focused on Black founded places. I am trying to help us challenge, right, our common understandings of what a town is, through a kind of legal and political history of this unit, right? This sort of place unit that we call a town. And I say, and I use town in particular because a lot of Black places, and this makes a ton of sense, right? Never got past, right, the sort of growth and development, actually the overwhelming majority, and you may say nearly all of them essentially, right, like never quite reached past the size of what we might conceive of as a town. So I'm not thinking of town in the sort of like literal like sense that it's only this kind of space I'm interested in. I'm interested in local place and the sort of unit that is like probably the closest to most of the places, most of the Black places I'm looking at is about a town size. Be that as it may, like the municipality, right? The idea of this sort of local place has a hold on all of our imaginations about what place should look like. And Black founded places or towns are often compared disfavorably, right, to that standard. And I'm trying to interrupt that because I think that what has developed in a lot of these Black founded places are the kinds of institutions, the kinds of social and political practices that would be very useful for us in the future. And so in other words, I think we should be learning from Black towns more so than we learned from the kinds of, cities and towns that we kind of see today. Not that there aren't good models, but I think there's something really important about looking to Black towns as other models. And it's not to essentialize these places as being just automatically, right, ideals in terms of local place. What I'm arguing is that Black folks by necessity, right, even if they believed in capitalism, right, even if they had, very similar aspirations for how they wanted to grow a place, in reality faced pretty serious structural and also interpersonal barriers to accomplishing just that, which, you can see as some evidence, right, the fact of the sort of size of Black towns, right? We do not have Black founded major metropolitan areas in this country. We don't. And there's a reason for that. But, by the same token, we're in a moment where we've taken an approach to local place that we know is unsustainable, right? We know that the way that we grow, right, the way that we treat land, The way that we relate to our ecosystem is unsustainable. And there are other models, not just in Black founded places, indigenous lands, right? Like indigenous practices. There are other place models that we can actually be looking to. So that's the direction of my work moving forward.
Are there any strategies that you've seen in your work with Black founded towns that you think are applicable and can scale to other places that are grappling with these issues? And just kind of thinking through a particular place and or strategy that you've seen among these towns that could be helpful in our understanding as we think about the future of cities.
Yeah, so one of the things, and I think that this, is probably super unpopular, maybe controversial, is this idea of scale. We have a problem of scale, right? Scale is, I think, is sort of one of our bigger problems, right? With this question of sustainability, this idea that everything that we do has to be expanded to a particular kind of scale, right? So I think that there's a questioning, right, that we have about how big is too big, right? Like what, people have, I think environmentalists, right, even traditional environmentalists have talked about, right, like what unchecked growth looks like, what it means for our planet, what it means for labor, what it means for resources, right, to think that we have to grow everything exponentially. And so there are different ways of relating to land and economy that I think might not take that kind of position. So I wanted to challenge just a little bit like that notion, right? Because that is very much a notion that's embedded in like how we think about development, right? It's like everything has to go to a particular scale. I think for Black founded towns, one of the things that I have, the relationship to land, I think to me is one of the most powerful examples of how things could be different than they are. I think, what it means to have a place, and it doesn't mean that people don't have mobility. I want to sort of divorce the notion of like fungible property from mobility, because I think those are two different things. But I think that, when you have a particular relationship to land and to place that isn't really about building up the land as an asset, so for you to then sell off so that you could buy something bigger, right? I think that that's a huge value. I think there's a lot of value to that. I think you steward land better when you have a deeper and more enduring relationship with it, right? When that's going to be the place where you live, right? Where you have relationship to. And it doesn't mean that you can't go other places, right? But it does mean that you have there's a different culture, right, around what your relationship to place is. And I think that's very hard, right? In our economy, people they move everywhere, right? Like, and it's all about, right? Like, oh, I build up, like, I can't sink this much money into this property because it's not worth X, right? Like that is a principle of, right, like, using land as capital, right? That I'm not saying that it does not exist, right? In some of these Black communities, it does not exist in the same way. And in part, right, it's because it's like never been allowed to exist in that way. I want to say, right, like it's both a kind of like imposed, right, barrier, and it's also something that has manifested itself within a culture of Black places that I think is important. So that's, I would say that kind of relationship to land is something that I would love to see us do more of as we think about what development, right, and what like our relationships to local place are.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Purifoy, for that. And just wanted to correct. So instead of scale, I said scale in lieu of best practices, which I don't necessarily believe in that term. I think every situation deserves its own approach. But I do believe there are models that we can learn from, and everything, and the wheel doesn't have to be recreated every single time. So that was what I meant with the scale piece.
Yeah.
But so we can't have you here at the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites and not talk a little bit about heritage and places that matter to you. So I'm really interested in sites, experiences that have been meaning to you personally. What are there sites that drive your work, or things, or Black founded towns that you're thinking about, or things that you can think about in your past that have resonated with you, that kind of undergird the work that you are leading nationally?
Sure. Wow, there are a lot of them. So my family is from both sides are from Detroit, Michigan, and via several, right, like Southern, mostly Black places right across the South. I will not recount all of them for you, but I think of myself as like really having had this, I think of as a cool experience in sort of several Black places, right? So, starting out with a family that's from a city that, people think of as a Black city. And I think people still think of as a Black city, even though the demographics of Detroit are shifting. And then moving to Durham, a place that was founded right after the Civil War, and certainly incorporated by a white government, right, as a municipality, but, was certainly founded more kind of unofficially, right, by several historic Black communities, many of whom were coming off of the Stagville plantation, which was one of the largest plantations in North Carolina. And so there are endless fights right now. In Durham, where I live, in a lot of these Black founded communities that were eventually sort of annexed into the city, like Hayti, like Bragtown, about their future now that we're having a tech boom down here in this region. They call it Research Triangle Park. Research Triangle Park is sort of one of the arenas, but the Triangle region, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, is, attracting a lot of tech development, right? And a lot of these communities that have sort of, been whittled away in various ways, right? Highways and, building highways through them, right? Sort of isolating them, cutting them off from other parts of the city, are now properties of interest, right? Lands of interest to these developers. And so, I have a real interest, right, as someone who grew up in these spaces, in their preservation. The reason my family moved to North Carolina was so that my dad could work his first job as a physician in Soul City, which, for those who don't know, is speaking of civil rights history, was established by the former, I think it was the head of CORE at some point, Floyd McKissick Sr., and Congress on Racial Equality, and was established under during the Nixon administration, with HUD funding, in Warren County, right? The same place where the environmental justice movement began. There's a lot of there's a lot of sort of back and forth about whether that's the birthplace, but let's just say, right, one of the major catalysts for the movement, happened in the place where 20 years earlier, right, less than 20 years earlier, Floyd McKissick Sr. was trying to found a Black town, and I spent a lot of time in that place as a young kid. And you want to talk about a model of a place that was actually modeled off on ideals of Black capitalism. Absolutely, right? but ultimately was stymied and eventually defunded, right? Thanks to a really concerted campaign by, it was going to be future senator at that point, Jesse Helms, with the help of the Raleigh News and Observer. So there's a ton of places that have just existed in my lifetime, right? Like been sort of core to my own life course that I think are so important in terms of preserving the history. I mean, in Soul City right now, they replaced the industries that Floyd McKissick Sr. had established in that town with a prison, right? And a prison cleaning products factory, essentially, right? That's, labored by incarcerated people. And so, that becomes the sort of legacy or history, right? Like of Soul City. And we have to preserve, right, what was there before, right? We have to preserve our understanding of what that place still is, right, in large part, right, but also what it was and what it was meant to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Soul City is a great example. We at the center posted about the city on our Instagram page. And it also makes me think about Kofi Boone's article that he wrote in Places Journal last year. So amazing example of a place that has impacted your work. So Dr. Purifoy, we're going to go to the Q&A period of the conversation. And Betsy asked, would Dr. Purifoy consider the Black ownership of churches analogous to the freedom of Black ownership, stewardship of land, as that the freedom extends beyond civil rights?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the first institutions that a lot of Black founded places establish are churches historically. I don't know about in our current moment, I should say that there are Black places being founded all the time, actually, still. But certainly in the post-Bellum era, right, through, wave after, World War II, right, and sort of down through the 20th century, Black churches were essential, right, social and political institutions, right? We know this from the Black freedom rights movement, right? We know this from that era. But it's also an example, right, of a relationship to land that extends beyond the single family home, or even, right, the home place, right? This is a place where it may be everyone in the town, right, or in the community has a deep and abiding relationship to this site and to this land and stewarding it. And that's, to me, why a lot of these churches still stand. I'm actually looking at one right now across the street from my house. There are about 6 to 7, right, like historic Black churches within the sort of vicinity of my home. And the congregations are very, 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 very small. But there is a deep commitment to preserving those places. So yeah, it's absolutely a really good example of a relationship to land, not just to land, certainly that, but also to an institution that's not the state, right? That's not, right, it's not your county government, it's not your municipal government, but it certainly has this political role and social role and acculturation role, right, in these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add, oftentimes we see, Black churches, preserving themselves. So it's an act of historic preservation by passing the collection plate around to contribute to the building fund. So seeing that as a really root, just as the ground zero of where preservation has and continues to happen at the local level.
Yeah, and even like the kinds of services, right, that come out of churches, right? Food services, right? Churches that have gardens, right, where there is food available. Like, I mean, churches do so many things, right? So many more things, right, in excess of, right, spiritual education and, a place of worship. So, yeah, and all of those, right, are tethered to this sort of sense of a commonwealth, right? Like a sense of a Black commons that really endures, that I see, right, enduring in these places.
Yeah, and Danielle, that's a perfect segue into our next question from Emily. I'm curious about the legal frameworks established in Black towns around property rights, property taxes, zoning, planning. How are these procedural aspects of governance written and adjudicated, in these communities, and are they different from dominant frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing to note, I guess there's two parts to answer this question. The first thing to note is that overwhelmingly, we don't know, okay, let me just say, we don't yet know how many Black towns and Black founded towns and communities exist within the United States. We don't really have. It's a separate project that I'm working on with a team of folks now to start to have a better understanding of just how many of these places exist and have existed. But what I will say that among those that we know, the vast majority of them are unincorporated. So they're not a municipality, they don't have a state charter, right? They're not a formalized municipality that's recognized by the state government. And what that means, and I think this is kind of gets to the point of like how important churches are. What that means is that the communities are, the legal framework that sort of they're bound by, right? At the local level exists at the county level, right? So they pay county taxes and those sort of things, but they don't really have the kind of like legal control over setting up those rules. And a lot of the communities that I've talked to have said that they don't want that, right? Like that's not actually part of the framework of how they're thinking about their place. So, a really good example is a place that I've been to called Tamina, Texas. It's unincorporated. It's about, it's just north of Houston. And, despite the fact that it's been sort of shrunken down and surrounded by these white municipalities that are definitely, right, like stripping resources from the community, they have remained unincorporated, and really their community center is essentially what I would think of as akin to their government. They, whenever there's a big decision for the community to make, they gather in that space. And they make decisions collaboratively. That same community center is also a daycare. It's also a notary, right? It serves a lot of different kinds of purposes, but it's not, the way that it's structured does not fall within the confines of how those legal structures work. The second part of that question is that among the incorporated Black municipalities, and there are lots of them, when you're chartered by the state, there are certain rules that you just have to follow, right, about how you set things up, right? There are things that aren't really that negotiable. I haven't done a deep dive into like how, for instance, like municipal ordinances in Black founded towns might look different than those in some in white towns. But suffice it to say, there's some flexibility, but like in some of the sort of basic structure of the municipality, because you're nested, right, within a county and a state government, ultimately federal government, there are rules that you have to follow. What I will say, and that's just sort of to reflect back to Whitehall, right, in Lowndes County, when it incorporated, is that the benefits of incorporation, right, the ability to access public dollars from the state, from the federal government to do things like build infrastructure, have been severely limited, right, in these places. So, there are Black communities who sometimes, typically when there's a threat, right, to their existence coming from a white municipality, may consider incorporation, or if they're lacking services, and seems to be the only way to get it. But in my experience and research, it's doesn't quite pan out the same way in terms of really vastly improving, right, the kinds of conditions that they were incorporating for.
Thank you for that that answer. So I was going to ask a follow-up question, but we're bumping up against time, so I'll ask that offline. But I did want to give the audience a last opportunity to ask Dr. Purifoy any more questions before we wrap our call this evening. Well, Danielle, I do want to say thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been an amazing conversation around Black founded towns. I'm a huge fan of your work. The center was very excited to invite you to join us today for this discussion. We look forward to continuing our conversation. And for our audience, please stay tuned for our next our virtual talk as a part of our dialogue series. We continue to bring in both academics and practitioners to have these conversations to expand our understanding of civil rights heritage nationally. So with that being said, thank you again, Danielle, for joining us tonight. And we look forward to staying in touch. Everyone else, thank you for joining and have a great night.
Thank you so much. Take care.